here a week
Wow.
and feel like I've got a bunch of friends. Did I tell you?
You can stay another week if you want.
Feel free to move here. Short, yeah.
We know it. So very encouraged by what I'm seeing happen and lots of really good stuff. What I want you to know, and I don't know if I told you last week, but we did shame in one day and anger in one day, and that's usually a whole week. So you guys are getting like your mouth held open and it's just getting poured down. Force fed. So to start, I just want to see if anybody had any questions that have come out of your weekend that you need to debrief or ask.
It's not really a question, but I've just been whenever I have extra time, I'll just open my book and just go through it and just kind of make like my own little extra graphs and stuff like that, just to kind of keep, because it takes a lot more to get into my head to remember things. And then I was thinking, why don't I phone I've had a friend from school for 30 years, and so she's going through a hard time right now, so I was like, maybe I'll just test some stuff on her. So today we talked for like 4.5 hours, and I was just teaching her all this stuff that I've learned. So it's like, it helped her so much to just, it kind of like, she knows so much and she's going to counseling, but then this was stuff that she's heard of like versions of it, but to hear it this way really helped her a lot. And yeah, I just want to say that it's really
neat.
Amazing, yeah, and to see like somebody that's been dealing with the same kind of like from really small town minds, and to have her kind of like open up and be like, maybe I don't need to always be with somebody, and be in all these very, very dangerous relationships, and for her to say, I just want to be on my own, and I was like, call me every day, and I want to know like what you're doing, who's talk to you, everything, like just to keep let her know I'll be there for her.
Yeah, and I think you probably found by trying to teach it to a friend, it just
so much more by doing,
Exactly. And that's to me the beauty of Jesus' ministry, because he taught the disciples and then he sent them out to teach.
Yes, exactly.
And that was going to take the thinking deeper. So whenever you got to teach something, you got to make sure you understand it. So you got to think about it at a deeper level, and it actually you benefit the most from having to teach.
Yes, the more I talked about it, the more I remember, and I wasn't like stumbling over like cortex and limbic and everything. I remembered it.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's pretty cool.
So if anybody had any good arguments with themselves and their limbic brain over the last few days? So everybody is very good at telling me they're exhausted. And so this topic tonight is one of the more practical ones, called boundaries. And just, I would say every treatment center teaches boundaries, and most counseling programs cover boundaries. Churches have your Townsend Boundaries book that they run small groups on. And in many ways, boundaries has become kind of a required reading for just about everywhere. And it's almost become such a fad that it's required everywhere. But when I teach it from the perspective of complex trauma. Because what I have found is people from complex trauma love taking boundaries courses, and so they know everything about boundaries. The problem is they never enforce those boundaries. So they can know them, but they need to figure out, why can't I enforce boundaries? And it's the complex trauma that is the issue. So we spend a whole week on it, not to regurgitate a lot of the stuff they get in other places, but to help them really realize that unless I deal with these issues, I'm not going to ever be good at setting boundaries. So just for example, What makes it hard for a shame-filled person to set a boundary and enforce it?
People will leave me.
People will leave me. They might get mad at me. I'll be all alone. So they're great at saying I'm setting a boundary, but then they cave on it the first time anybody gets angry at them or guilt trips them, etc. So they realize unless I deal with my shame, I'll never be able to set boundaries consistently and enforce them. So we spend a lot of time just helping them understand that. So we're going to cover a lot of stuff up front, just give you a bit of a teaching grid regarding boundaries, but then we're going to go into the complex trauma piece and how it affects boundaries. One of the things I wanted to say, just kind of outside of that, and Mac, you can, and everybody here can probably relate to it, but I think it's important in your own boundaries within a treatment center to have some clarity in your thinking around swearing. So what I find is that when people get to hard issues, they start swearing. It's their language of their heart, is F words. It gives them an adjective that makes sense to them, that describes the intensity adequately. And so if people start saying, don't say that, you shut them down. So you have to be able to tolerate a certain amount of that. And what I have found is that when people say that, they're not trying to be disrespectful, they're not trying to be crass or rude. That's just how they talk. That's just their mother tongue. And I think Christians have done a lot of damage by making too many rules around that, especially in treatment centers. When I was in Tamarack Secular Treatment Center, there used to be this big sign on the wall, keep your swearing outside. And then I would always laugh because when one of the counselors would get really mad, they just start dropping F-bombs at her. And it was like they could say it when they're mad, but nobody else can. And anyway, that's just for you to be aware of. Okay, so let's start with a definition. Anybody, how would you define a boundary? And let me see this up front. Most clients, if they haven't been in recovery at all before, they have no idea what a boundary is. They don't even know what we're talking about. So you need to be able to give them a clear definition and then some illustrations so they can begin to get the concept of a boundary. So a boundary basically is rules and guidelines, and it's got two-part focus. It's what makes me safe and what makes me healthy. So I use the example of being a parent. So what do you do as a parent? You make rules and guidelines for your children. So you say you got to be in bed by this time, you got to eat these food, you got to do your homework, you got to do chores, don't talk to strangers, don't play in the street. All of those are rules and guidelines to keep them safe and to keep them healthy. And so they are the rules and guidelines of love. It's basically as to what creates a safe, healthy environment. And once they understand that, they begin to say, okay, I get the concept now. And then I use the illustration of a person in recovery. What kind of rules and guidelines do you need if you're going to make it in recovery? So you got to say no to certain people. You got to go to and do certain things every day, like go to a meeting, phone your sponsor, do prayer, meditation. So they begin to realize, wow, I create rules and guidelines for myself if I ever am going to stand a chance in recovery. And that takes it to the next thing, is there's two types of boundaries. There's external and internal. So internal are the rules I make for myself. So I'm going to get up at 6 in the morning, I'm going to read my Bible, I'm going to pray, I'm going to work out, and you create all of that. I'm going to make sure I'm in bed by 10 or 11. I'm not going to watch certain types of movies, etc. So you create all these boundaries to keep yourself healthy and to keep yourself safe. Okay? That's part of life. But what clients will quickly realize is we're great at setting internal boundaries. I'm not gonna snack tonight. And I sit down, I'm bored, and I wanna snack. And so the way we go at breaking the very rules we set for ourselves. So they begin to realize it's easy to set rules. And in recovery, every client makes a beautiful recovery plan. That's not the issue, it's following that plan. And so internal boundaries aren't just making rules for myself, it's figuring out how to keep those rules. Because that's where the battle is fought. External boundaries are rules that govern how I will treat other people and how I will let other people treat me. So that's part one. So it's relationship rules. And then there's a second piece to that, and that is how close I'll let others into my life. So will I let them text me and phone me whenever they want? Will I let them drop over? Or am I going to keep them at arm's length and say, you know what, I'll say hi to you when I see you on Sundays or whatever, but outside of that, I just can't have you any closer into my life. And that becomes a very big issue in recovery because you get a lot of people who are afraid to say no, and then they get a pushy person saying, can I get a ride with you? Can I spend time with you? Can I do this? And before you know it, they got somebody that's crammed in really close to them who's toxic. And it messes them up. And so that's kind of the main pieces around the boundary stuff. So let me give you an example, and we'll cover this. So this week we're going to do boundaries and emotions, two really big. And then when I come back in 3 weeks, we're going to do 2 weeks on relationship issues. And it's a huge thing, but I want to give you this because it helps people get the idea of this closeness. So we teach the 4 levels of relationship. So number 1 is an acquaintance. So quickly throw out, how would you define acquaintance?
Somebody you work with but don't have a solid office relationship.
Okay, exactly. So you know their name, you know a little bit about them, you say hi. And so we have hundreds of people that are acquaintances, and they are the arm's length people. We see them. When we see them, we don't try to see them outside of those natural places. There's not any risk in the relationship because we're not revealing, there's not an intimacy that would create risk. Then there's the second one. So some of the people who are acquaintances will talk to them a little bit and they go, you know what, I kind of like this person. And we will move them to a little bit closer. A casual friend. How would you define a casual friend?
Somebody go to coffee?
Yeah. Yeah. So you will spend time with them around an activity. So let's go to a football game, let's go have a coffee. And so you reveal a little bit more of yourself, you take a few more risks, you allow for a little bit more intimacy, but they're still at a somewhat of a distance. Okay? And then a close friend. So just to give you kind of another way to look at this, which emotions will you show with an acquaintance and a casual friend?
Surface.
Which is happy all the time, basically, right? With a close friend, you know what, now I might let them see that I'm stressed or sad or even a bit angry. That's a huge risk that I'm now willing to take. I will open up about some of my beliefs, some of my values, knowing that to reveal some of those things might cause somebody to reject me.
Can I come and listen for a little bit?
Take care of it. So what you find here is the closeness or intimacy with each layer is deepening. But with that, there's a risk that's increasing, that you might get hurt. Okay? And then, a soulmate. So a soulmate is somebody with whom you would have total vulnerability, total openness, no masks, no walls, no secrets. So what I do with clients is say, here we have hundreds. How many do we have when it comes to a soulmate? One or two. Now what's sad for most people is that soulmate should be your spouse, but in many cases it's not. And what's really sad is that people from complex trauma who've got walls and masks, they don't have any soulmates. They can have a close friend, but they've never totally taken down all the walls. So what I want clients to understand is you can't get a soulmate overnight, but you need to work at it, because if you don't have that kind of relationship, your chances in recovery really drop. You need that kind of accountability, intimacy, honesty, openness. Okay, now, so they get that. There's boundaries here that I'm not going to let everybody that's an acquaintance here. I'm not going to let them into a closer piece into my life. Follow? Now let me show you the next thing that it's always one of those things that is good for a laugh, but it hits home. Here's what I tell clients. You meet somebody, they're hot, you say, let's go to bed, I love you, and you go in your mind, and then the next morning, what was your name again? But we're soulmates now. And so what happens within complex trauma is love equals intense emotion. And so if I meet you and feel intensity, then I think we have intimacy. And as soon as then I jump into bed with you, then I got what I think is a close friend. Problem is I don't even know you. So what begins to happen in that is you haven't gone the natural progression, which is gradually checking out their character. And if they're trustworthy, if they're honest people, if they're loving people, I let them closer and closer. You've gone to the intimacy, physical intimacy, and you've missed intellectual intimacy, emotional intimacy, all of those things, and you got it all backwards. And so then what you do, instead of saying, let's go back here and get to know each other, you say, let's try to stay here and I'll just try to control you and change you. And you start the control manipulation game. Any questions on that? So almost everybody in recovery realizes that they don't do relationships well because they don't do boundaries well. And so their limbic brain is what guides them in the relationship instead of their cortex. Now here's where it gets really tricky but very important in understanding clients. You're going to get clients that grow to a point where they meet somebody and they are impressed with them and they tell you, I want to do it right and I want to go slow. So one of the things that I ask clients when I teach this is, how long naturally do you think it would take to go from an acquaintance to a genuine healthy soulmate? How long a period of time?
A year.
3 months.
Couple of years.
For most people, I kind of go 6 months to a year, and that's being very generous. And so what you'll say, get a client say, okay, I want to do this right. I want to go slow, but as soon as the oxytocin starts pumping, it gets sped up. So they start off really slow, and then they're texting each other all throughout every day, seeing each other every day. And before you know it, they're moving in together, and they go, well, that took two weeks rather than 2 days, so I guess that's progress. But their ability to go slow and maintain the boundaries is really, really hard. So that oxytocin piece triggers the limbic brain, and as soon as that's triggered, all the good thinking around enforcing boundaries goes out the window. So those are things that just help clients realize up front, I got boundary issues. I don't think I do this very well. And then the next thing, so what I tell clients is this. In my mind, unless you learn boundaries, you'll never make it in recovery. Boundaries becomes a very, very important piece. So boundary is as saying no to certain people, no to certain activities. Boundaries is adding new pieces to your life consistently that help you stay on track. So boundaries covers every relationship, every hobby, activity, personal discipline, everything is included in boundaries. And that's where most people fail. So it becomes a super important topic. So the biggest issue for most people is family, setting boundaries with family. One of the things that comes out of complex trauma is that we talked about unhealthy loyalty, which says I'm not allowed to set a boundary with my family. I have to have them in my life. If they want to be in my life, they can walk all over me. And so many, many people try it, but quickly find it keeps leading to a relapse. And so they get to a place that I have to deal with my family. And so for some, it will be they have to walk away from their family. But that's only a few that will have to do that. Others, it's just pushing the family to a further out boundary. And they realize how hard that is to do. But it's super important. The next part, besides family, is so people will know academically, I need to get rid of my old using friends, but then they'll start to go to other old friends that aren't necessarily healthy, they just didn't use, so they think they're okay. And then they get pulled down by them, and so they get to a point where they have to say, I can't have tons of the people in my past in my life. And they think they're okay with that until they sit in the loneliness for a while. Because they haven't made new friends yet. And they're afraid of making new friends. That's a scary thing. And so now all of a sudden they're lonely, and instead of reaching out to make new friends, they go, oh, I'll just phone my old friend, or I'll phone my ex, and just chat. And before you know it, they're drawn right back in. So this is a huge area that really affects everything about their success in recovery. So any questions up front as we start to move forward?
I find that many people don't know they have the right to set boundaries where the boundaries should be.
Exactly. And we're going to get to that because it's so important. So what you missed at the beginning was the issue around boundaries. You have to factor in complex trauma. So complex trauma people aren't good at setting boundaries because they don't think they deserve it, or they can't stand up for themselves, all of those things. So we're going to get into that as we go along because it is the center of the issue here.
So do you lay out at the beginning in phase 1 boundaries?
Yes.
Some of this?
Yeah, so this is where the phase 2 teaching gets ahead of the phase 1 teaching. So
Okay.
I think next week or the week after, you're going to have a day on boundaries.
Because I'm just thinking as we're running the program,
Yeah.
we're going to want to have this set up because
Yeah.
they're going to link this friend in the past.
Exactly. So phase 1, we spend a day and introduce it.
Okay.
And then in phase 2, we spend a whole week. Because it's such a big piece to it. So yeah, you didn't get the phase 1 part yet.
So boundaries one of really hard, is that like one of those blockers?
Oh, it's
People in
huge.
recovery?
Yeah. So a lot of people are going to try to do recovery without setting boundaries, and then they're going to find out they keep failing. And it's almost like they have to get forced into such a bad place that they go, if I don't set a boundary, I can't make it. I would say the third area where it's tough is if they came into recovery in a relationship with somebody that either they used with or somebody that tried to rescue them, and it's not a healthy relationship, they will do well in recovery and then the relationship will take them out. And then they'll get back on track and they'll do well and the relationship will take them out. And they'll get to the point, and I've said this to clients, I said, if you don't change this relationship thing, we're going to be having the exact same conversation 5 years from now. Because you're just going to keep doing the same thing. And they just do not want to face that, because now their fears, their codependency, all those other issues come in. And so what you're going to find in helping people realize where the boundary needs to be and be enforced is it's going to bring up all their fear, it's going to bring up all their shame stuff, all of their underlying issues now come to the surface. And that's why it's so hard. Yeah. You're agreeing?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
I think it's fair to say some people's traumas are around, what you're talking about, that complex trauma with boundaries.
Yes.
So they've had bad boundaries in the past.
Exactly. So that's where we're going now. So just to kind of get people thinking, what I do is this. Families that commit complex trauma, they have boundaries. They're just unhealthy boundaries. So what are the boundaries of an unhealthy family? Don't talk, don't feel, don't trust. Dad gets whatever he wants. Boundaries are all about what's good for dad. They're not what's good for people. So they're very distorted. They don't have love as their focus. They have dad's selfishness as their guide. So those become, once you begin them to see that you've had boundaries all your life, they've just been very unhealthy. And they haven't kept you safe. Well, they kept you safe in the moment. Don't trust, don't feel, don't talk. That seemed to keep you safe, but it caused you to destroy all your future relationships. So what I want them to understand is the rules of complex trauma set up future relationships to fail. You can never have a successful relationship based on the rules of complex trauma or the boundaries of complex trauma. So I tell clients, it doesn't matter how much you're in love, if you're still following the old boundaries, it won't work no matter how badly you want it to. So you have to change that, and that's, yeah. So let's just go through the boundaries or complex trauma. So the boundaries guide is not love, it's the authority selfishness. You guys, in the 60 characteristics, did you learn about ODD? Oppositional defiance? Okay. So if you grow up with a boundary that's never about what's good for you, only what dad wants, you develop a defiance about rules. So I ask clients, if you saw a sign that said wet cement don't touch, what would you want to do? So what I want them to understand is complex trauma actually creates a defiance of any boundary. Because it creates the belief that boundaries restrict my fun and restrict my life, and fun is outside of rules. So let's break rules, then we'll find fun and happiness. So complex trauma, bad boundaries condition you to rebel against all boundaries. And that's really important for them to see up front, is they gotta not just change some specific boundaries, they gotta change their entire perspective on rules and authority. And that's a big shift for most people. Okay, so many complex trauma, lots and lots of rules, rules for everything or no rules. So most don't have a very healthy proportion of rules.
Or changing rules.
Yes, that's what we're coming to next. So let me say what you're going to find with people. When I worked at Tamarack, and I began to work with other treatment centers in Winnipeg and other recovery places, I went, here are people coming out of complex trauma now running surrogate families. And they're just as sick as what they came out of, because they haven't grown in their own life. And so how I explained it was, if you have people out of dysfunction that haven't healed, they'll create dysfunctional institutions. And that's scary because that's taking a client into a treatment center that's no different than home. And so they're not gonna feel safe eventually. So what I saw in treatment centers is every time somebody misbehaved, new rule. And before you know it, you got 100 different rules about every little thing. And it was like, clients were used to that growing up. They just got more sneaky. They didn't respect those rules. They were very much motivated by fear for a little while. But what they realized is dysfunctional families, there's a new rule enforced for 2 weeks and everybody forgets about it. And it goes back to the way it used to be. And so rules become a joke after a while. It is, dad's gonna have a little temper tantrum, let him get over it, and then it'll go back to the way it used to be. So when we started to react, I said I wanna have as few rules as possible. Because I don't wanna be over dictating every little thing, micromanaging, because that's what they come out of. So that becomes important, and what I found, so when you look at, remember the Beatitudes? Jesus didn't come out with rules, he came up with attitudes. He said if the attitude's right, the behavior will follow. So focus on the attitudes. Get that right, then you don't need rules. So I love to do this with clients. I go, if everybody in Surrey had great internal boundaries, so they lived in a healthy, godly way, and they stuck to it, you realize we wouldn't need police? You realize that you wouldn't need to lock your car or your house, you could leave your wallet on the seat, nobody's gonna steal from you because everybody's got deep and good internal boundaries. So the measure of a society's health is how much police you need to maintain external boundaries. So if the only way you can control people is external boundaries because nobody has good internal boundaries, then you've got a problem society. So the design of parenting is children don't come with natural internal boundaries, so parents are supposed to set healthy external boundaries for them that are designed to keep them healthy and safe. And they're enforced by positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement. Double motivators, okay? You reward them when they do well, there's consequence when they break the boundary, all designed to keep them in the healthy boundary. As they stick to those boundaries, they internalize them, so that by the time they become an adult, they don't need lots of rules because it's all inside now. That's the design. But if you have a society where that didn't happen, then you have adults with no internal boundaries. So the only way to keep order is police, external enforcement, external motivation. And that's a bit of a sad commentary on our society as to where we're at today. But it's an important thing. So take that a little bit further to treatment. One of the things that happens with residential treatment is you move in, you have boundaries, and you have fear motivation. If you don't follow them, here's the consequence. You're not going to like it, you're going to get kicked out. Everybody is great because they know how to operate in that world. All external boundaries, external motivation, enforcement. Graduate, put them outside, now it's all your internal boundaries. Oops, I never learned that. Relapse. And so the challenge in recovery is clients need some external boundaries, but if we don't help them get internal boundaries, they will fail. And so that they have to provide, and so we do a whole day, even sometimes 2 days on internal boundaries, because that is basically their success is dependent on getting good internal boundaries. Any questions on that? Everybody sees the importance of all of that? Okay, good. Okay, next one. Inconsistent boundaries and enforcement. So we talked about the child's radar. So if dad's in a good mood, we can get away with a lot more than if he's in a bad mood. And so some days he'll enforce the rule, some days he won't enforce the rule, depends on what mood he's in. And so there's not a consistency. Or mom will enforce the rules if she's not tired, but if mom's really tired, she'll just say, go do whatever you want, just don't bother me. And the rules aren't enforced. And so some will get very strict to very lenient, and then with this inconsistent, what gets added is two parents, where one parent does one set of rules and the other parent does a different set. So you get that more and more in divorced, children of divorce, because they go to dads and they get away with murder, and they go to moms and it's run like a battleship. And so they have two different set of rules, and they learn how to play both. So if you go back to the first one, add this. Many complex homes, there's two sets of boundaries. One set for dad and the other one for everybody else. Or if there's a spoiled child or a favored child, there's a different set of boundaries for that child than everybody else. So you can begin to realize how shame can come out of a lot of this. And so shame is often connected to the boundaries that were part of your upbringing. So how boundaries are enforced. So the primary motivation of complex trauma to get a kid to keep the rules, what is it? Fear. What is God's design for the primary motivation to keep the rules? Love. With complex trauma, you don't want to risk that. And so what complex trauma teaches you is you do loving things in order to get love. What healthy family is, you are loved, so now you do things not to earn love, but to express the love you feel. It overflows out of you. So you're never in question as to whether you're loved. That's the base, that's solid, and now everything comes out of that. Whereas complex trauma, you're not loved, somehow I gotta try to earn it. And so fear becomes the motivation. So what I do with clients is this. Fear will motivate you in the short run, because that's your limbic system. How did the fear motivate you in the long run? It turned you into a rebel. And so fear is a short-term solution to get people to follow a boundary. And so what you find in the Bible, God says there's great benefits for keeping the boundary, and there's natural consequences for not keeping the boundary. And so there's that blend of positive and negative that is all part of that. And so most people are used to an angry God because they had an angry dad. And their perception of God comes out of that. And so that fear motivation for many of them is big. Okay? Another type of motivation that is used in complex trauma. Anybody? Shame. Shame. Exactly. So tear the child down. Wear them down, beat them down, then they will do it. A third is a penalty that is over the top, where the penalty doesn't suit the crime. So I call it hitting an ant with a sledgehammer. It's way more than what is called for. So you'll get this heavy-handed consequence that doesn't fit the crime. And then another one is long rants. Any of you grew up with long rants from a parent? You're going to sit in that chair for 1 hour while I preach a sermon to you about how bad you are and why you shouldn't do it. And I say to them, and after the first second, where did your brain go? Oh, I tuned mom out. Because I've heard it 1,000 times. And it doesn't work anymore. But they still feel the need to give the long rants. And then another way is you are a fortune teller. You're going to end up on the streets. You're going to end up a drug addict like me. And you try to scare them straight. Predict this terrible future because they did one little thing wrong. So all of those kind of come under fear, shame, working together as your main way of motivating. Any questions on that part? Okay, next one. For most people in complex trauma, no doesn't mean no. It just means try harder or learn to manipulate better. So if somebody said, no, you can't have it, then you would come out with, well, what can I do now to get my way? Oh, I'll be really sweet to dad, I'll do extra chores to dad, I'll snuggle up to dad, and I'll work them. And so no doesn't mean no, it just means try harder. One way to, two ways to help people really see the importance of that. So, abusive relationships. So you realize you're in an abusive relationship, and then you say it's over, and then what happens next if it's a real narcissist? No, they start sending you texts, they send you flowers, they apologize, they ask if you'll just meet with them and talk, they're so sorry, and they will just try to break you down. And you say no, you don't answer their calls, you don't answer their texts, they show up at your door, you don't talk to them. And finally you get so tired of it, you say, okay, I'll talk to you, and then what did you teach them?
Nothing.
No doesn't mean no.
So then with kids, the one parent will like tell, oh, your mom doesn't love me anymore. And just tell her that I still love her. And they use the kids to that.
Exactly. So when it comes to parenting, it's really important because, so I tell this with clients, and it's, if your kid's misbehaving, you say, stop doing that, what's the chances that they're gonna stop? And they go, nobody puts their hand up and say, my kids will stop if I stop. They'll just keep doing it. And I go, okay, so what's it gonna take? Well, you raise your voice next and they still don't stop. You yell, they still don't stop. Then you say, I'm gonna count to 10, and you better be stopped by 10, and they don't stop at 7 or 8, and then you get to 9, and then you go 9 1/2, 9 3/4, and then they stop. Because now they know you're serious. So I say to parents, what did you just train your children? No didn't mean no. They gotta wait until they know your serious point, and then they will obey. So you set them up actually to have poor boundaries by doing that. So that usually they can connect to at that level. So no boundaries allowed with parents. I have many clients who have been so hurt that their mom went into their room and read their diary and didn't respect their privacy. Or they shared something with mom and asked her not to talk about it, and next thing their aunts and uncles and grandparents are talking to them about, I hear you're cutting, etc. And they're just so hurt and damaged by that. And it's because some kids you can set boundaries with everybody else but never with us. We can do whatever we want. And if you set boundaries with us, you're bad. We will make you feel guilty. And so that happens often in a sexual abuse, molestation, where they feel they don't have the right to say no, because that's how they were raised. And so that becomes a huge issue for many people. And then we've talked about established boundaries by anger or isolation. So the only way they know to set a boundary is to hide out in their room or blow up at everybody. Feel guilty for saying no, we just talked about. And then there's one final one I want to give you, because this one becomes a huge thing. And it's this. The only way they know how to set a boundary is to close their heart. So, you think of it this way, somebody's bugging you a lot in your recovery and you know you gotta set a boundary. The only way they know how to do that is close their heart to that person and hate them. Because if they have an open heart, they just can't set a boundary. So their only tool for actually enforcing it is I have to take away all good feelings towards that person and close my heart. Does that make sense to you? And so a huge challenge for them is going to be, and you can imagine how hard it is, setting boundaries but keeping my heart open. So that's totally new territory, and it's scary to death. Because that means I'm risking getting hurt. So I hope you can see from that when you're raising complex trauma, the boundaries wound you, but the boundaries set you up to fail. And so this whole idea of learning how to set healthy boundaries is a brand new concept. And it will take major, major changes. So what I tell clients is this, because a lot of people take that first day of the course and they all want to run home and start setting 100 new boundaries with their kids and 100 new boundaries with their parents and their spouse and all that. Go, whoa, 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 whoa. One at a time. Don't change the whole thing overnight. Just work on changing one boundary at a time. And so you basically pace yourself. Because if you go back and say, I'm going to change 1,000 things, and then your children are traumatized by that because their whole world just got turned upside down, or you make all these changes and then you relapse yourself and then everything goes back to the way it was, you've trained them again that your word doesn't mean anything. So it becomes really important to pace yourself, do it gradually. Okay, any questions on that part? Okay. Two other things that I wanted, or three things I wanted to say about the complex trauma. So, I'm going to draw this first. So in a healthy relationships, you start people at arm's length and you gradually let them closer over time if they prove to have good character. Complex trauma, you do it the opposite. Let's be buddies. Then you realize this guy's a jerk, how do I get rid of him? Or you shack up together, but your relationship just starts to drift. Soon you're not having sex together, soon you can't say anything respectful to each other, you can't stand to have the person around, and so your boundaries go further, your relationship goes further and further apart. So I like to do that for people just to have a picture that complex trauma sets you up to do it backwards. And so it's hard to do it patiently, to keep people at a distance when you like them, and gradually move towards greater intimacy, but it becomes very important. Okay, the next thing I want people to understand is this. We take some of our boundaries down in a moment, okay? We set a boundary, and then somebody says something, and we take it down. In abusive relationships, the way they break your boundaries down is a gradual process of breaking you. So if they tear you down enough over a long enough period of time, then you'll have no boundaries at all. They can do whatever they want, and you will feel guilty for ever standing up for yourself. So I want them to realize that the tearing down of your boundaries can be instant or very gradual. Are you familiar with the term gaslighting? No? Some are, some aren't.
Putting out the fire with gasoline?
Gaslighting is actually based on a movie that was named Gaslighting that was done in the 50s, I believe. But it's this. So let's say I'm the abusive person, let's say Kim's my spouse. So every time she points out a flaw, in our relationship or in me, I twist it and make her the problem. And I make her believe that she's perceiving everything wrong. So she starts to doubt herself, she starts to doubt her own perceptions, and eventually thinks maybe I'm crazy. So gaslighting, and I get clients all the time where they will put something on their counter and their partner will purposely take it and hide it. And when they come back and say, I thought I put my keys there, they go, no, your keys were never there. And they start doubting themselves. And then they get in an argument and they twist everything and make the other person feel they're wrong, they've done everything wrong. Meanwhile, the abuser is the wrong one. But if they can get a person to doubt themselves long enough, they break them. And so that's that slow, gradual breaking a person down. So you're dismantling their self-image, any self-confidence, even their own thinking, their own perception, and their own value. And so that we'll talk potentially more about, because it's a huge area for a lot of people to understand. And then the last thing, and then we'll take a break. How does a shame-based person feel when you set a boundary with them?
Rejected.
Exactly. And so that's one of the reasons why it's hard for people to set boundaries, because I'm going to hurt their feelings. I don't want to hurt their feelings, because I know they're going to feel rejected. And so if a person is concerned more about the other person's feelings than their own health, that's codependency. But it's a huge issue because they know how much it hurts when somebody sets a boundary with them. Questions on that? Let's take a break.
Can you say if a person cares more about,
Then it might hurt your feelings. So I'll keep myself sick because I don't want to hurt your feelings. So I'll stay in a bad relationship and let you abuse me because I don't want to leave it because it'd hurt your feelings.
and that's codependency?
Okay, break. Well, we ready to roll? So I think you're kind of getting this sensation that this can turn into a very, very practical piece for people in recovery, but there is a heavy part to it. Because they begin to realize how much they have to change is part of it. One of the things that I do with people is say, how many areas of your life have to remain unhealthy before you relapse? So if you don't look at every area of your life that's unhealthy and start getting healthier, how long can you stay in unhealthiness before you relapse? And that's important. So if you still hang around with just one of your old friends, what will that do to you? If you still spend time with your mom who shames you all the time, and what you do is never good enough, how will that's only two unhealthy things. If you're still watching porn every night, how does that affect you? So they begin to realize I got to look at every area of my life. Because if it's not moving towards healthiness, it could pull me backwards. And that's really where we're going in the whole boundary thing. Just a couple of other teaching tools that help people sometimes with boundaries is, so we said that for most people to set a boundary, they got to close their heart to the person. And so to them, a boundary is a wall. That's all they know as a boundary. And so what you're teaching them is a boundary is a fence with a gate. And so some people you let in, other people you don't. So that changes the imagery a little bit. What I like to do is take it a bit further. There's some people in my life that I will let them through the gate of the fence into the backyard, but they're not coming in my house. Because they're not safe to be in my house. Other people I'll let them in to the vestibule, the landing area of the house, but they're not going any further than that. Closer friends, I'll let them into the living room and chat with them. Real close friends, they can go hang out in the family room with me. But only one person's getting in the bedroom. And so they begin to realize, okay, we have natural boundaries in life, and a house illustrates that. And we let certain people only in certain parts, and other people in other parts. So it's another word imagery that can help them get the concept. Another thing that I do with clients, and it's a word picture thing, but I actually draw it because this is easy for me to draw. Any idea what I just drew?
Cheese.
It's a Lego block.
Stole my ego.
I wanna play.
So what I tell people is this. When you think about boundaries, the external and how close do you let people, a lot of it is dependent on your own energy and limitations of time. So I just say, I'm a Lego block that has 6 spots available for close people. After that, I don't have enough energy to add an 8, 7, 8, 9, 10. I've only got enough energy for 6. Now that doesn't mean the other people are bad. It's I can't do it. I just have to set a limitation. So some of the boundaries you set by not letting people in is because they're not healthy. Okay, they get that. But some in recovery especially, I have to set because I'm too weak, I'm too tired, I'm limited. And if I don't do that, pushy people will keep taking up more and more of my time, and I'll forget about myself and I'll relapse. So part of boundary setting is protecting myself in light of my limitations. Another way to illustrate that is I will ask people, if I was to sit down with you right now and watch a movie of somebody shooting up meth or smoking crack, would you be able to resist relapse? And they go, no. Do you want to relapse? No. Well, you wouldn't be able to resist it. Right. So it's important to understand some boundaries are all about, I'm too weak right now. Maybe in a year I can go to my parents' house and they can drink in front of me and it won't affect me. But right now, if I go to my parents' house and they all start drinking, I'm not strong enough to resist that. And so some boundaries are temporary based on how strong or how vulnerable I am. So boundary setting is based on seeing myself accurately and my vulnerabilities accurately. So some of the boundaries about keeping safe are in light of how vulnerable I am. Make sense? Okay? So the next one, some boundaries are non-negotiable. They are a line in the sand. If you cross it, it's done. And those usually involve morals of some kind. So absolutes. You cheat on me, it's over. You lie to me, I'm not going to trust you. This friendship will never get closer than what it is. So just stop and think about this. I say to clients all the time, I have a lot of really awful people in my life, but they got firm boundaries out here. They're not getting close to me. So I don't require everybody in my life to be a sterling character. I let a lot of people who don't have very good character into my life, but there's firm boundaries. It's those that I let close to me that have the sterling character. So that becomes a difference. So, non-negotiable morals. So if you lie to me, I'll still have you as an acquaintance, but you're never going to be a close friend. If you cheat on me or steal from me, you can be an acquaintance, but you're never going to be a close friend. So they can start to get that, okay? But then it's important for them to understand that some boundaries are negotiable. So, Kim is a night owl, I'm a morning person. So we get married and, well, I want to go to bed now because it's 9 o'clock. And she says, oh, the night's young, I'm just getting going. Do I say, here's my boundary? I go, no, we got to negotiate this. So I like movies, high body count, she can't stand them. She likes sappy movies, I can't stand. Now what do we do to watch movies? We got to negotiate. So those are boundaries. So what happens in complex trauma is the authority figure, none of his boundaries are negotiable. These are my rules, it's my way or the highway. And that is abuse. So healthy boundaries, you understand the difference between your morals and your preferences. And that becomes very important. So the danger for authority when you have the power position is you're tempted to make your preferences the law. But love says I continue to negotiate around my preferences so that everybody is being loved and the morals are the absolute. Okay? Is that all clear? So let's move on. This can be a fun part of teaching. But I say, okay, you set a boundary with your parents. I can't spend as much time with you. I got to focus on my recovery right now. And a week later, you're letting your parents come over and visit whenever they want. So you set a boundary and then you take it down, or they find a way to get past your boundary. So why is that? Why aren't we able to enforce our boundaries once we establish them? So number one, the technical term is hooks. Has anybody heard of hooks? So it's how do I hook the person to go back to the old boundary? Okay, so now what I do at this point usually is this. If you set a boundary with your family, what can you expect as their response?
Not respect.
Resistance, war,
Rejection.
because you're changing the rules that have been operating for years. And you're not just going to get rejection, because what they're thinking and seeing is you're saying the way you guys do it is wrong. You're bad that way, and they take that and are offended by that. And so what I want people to understand is every boundary will result in opposition from somebody. So don't set a boundary until you're ready to enforce it, because there will be a war in some cases. And most addicts in early recovery, they're out setting boundaries everywhere, and they're not ready for the opposition because they think everybody's going to go, oh, okay, I'll respect your boundary. And that hardly ever happens. And then they're not ready for the opposition, and the boundaries cave in, and they just taught the people again that your boundaries, your word means nothing. So don't set a boundary until you're ready and strong enough to enforce it. So hook number one, which is probably the most common one, is guilt. So you say to mom, we can't come over for all day Christmas Day, we got another commitment. And then you get a phone call, mom says, after all I've done for you, I can't sleep at night because I wonder where I went wrong. And you're saying, okay, we'll come for the whole day. So guilt is a massive hook for most people. Now guess what your kids are learning? How to manipulate you. You're a terrible mom. And you go, oh, I feel so guilty. Okay, I'll have whatever you want.
You only do that because you're my adopted mother.
Exactly. So what I want clients to realize at this point, because is this: if somebody tried guilt on a healthy person, it wouldn't sway them at all, because they know what is right and they're going to stick to it. So guilt works on people with shame, because it brings it to the surface and you feel it. Okay, and so clients usually at this point will begin sharing their parents' guilt trip things, and they laugh about it, they kind of see it for what it is, and so I let them share about that for a while. The next big hook is anger. And so most people are afraid of mom being angry at them, dad being angry at them, people being angry at them. And so they'll fold their boundary quickly just to stop you from being angry. So it's a powerful manipulation tool. Some will use the pouting, underhanded stuff we talked about. And so mom doesn't talk to you when you phone, she doesn't answer your call. You drive over there and she gives you one-word answers, and you're getting shut out. And so that makes a person just feel like, well, please forgive me, I won't do that again, I won't do that, just talk to me, just talk to me. And so that can become a powerful tool for a lot of people. Good old name. If I ask enough times, I'll wear you down. Okay, let's see what you got. What are tricks that work on you? So how I present this is this. This is your toolbox when you come out of complex trauma. So if somebody says no to you, you go, oh, okay, no problem, let me go to my toolbox. Oh, okay, I'll just drag out my guilt tool. Okay, that didn't work, no problem, I got lots more tools here, I'll go drag out my anger tool. And then we'll keep going one tool after another. So be prepared not just for one battle, but for a second, third, fourth, fifth battle, each one with a different strategy. And that's kind of what begins to happen, okay? So, create a crisis. Things are falling apart here, we need you right now, please come over. And you drop everything and run. Anybody relate to that one? Okay?
I have one that's not funny, but it is funny. If you can't see me when I'm alive, don't bother coming to my funeral.
And that's a bit of a guilt one.
Yeah. Oh,
Or you're gonna send me to my grave,
yeah.
because you're breaking my heart.
Some kids got asthma attack when parents went to divorce.
Yes, yeah. And some of that is,
Crisis.
some of that's not so much a manipulation, it's just the insecurity and stress and panic of all of that. The complex trauma is triggered. Yeah. Anybody know what love bombs are? Okay. We know you're really struggling financially, here's $100.
Oh, I like those.
Families, yeah.
Now you're afraid to say no to them. So all of a sudden all these gifts start coming, these thoughtful little things, buttering you up, breaking down your resistance. And that's the reverse strategy of the anger and the guilt.
That's why I hate gifts, they come with an obligation.
Well, and for most people, gifts have always had strings attached.
Yeah.
And they never have a gift for the sake of a gift. Okay? Triangulation, do you know what that is?
Using somebody else to.
Exactly.
Victim, rescuers.
So you're talking with mom and setting a boundary, and now you're getting a call from grandma. They're saying, why are you doing that to your mom? Or a sibling, or somebody else, but somebody else gets involved. And part of triangulation can be you recruit support for your position. So you're not listening to mom, so mom goes and recruits grandma, Aunt Susie, Aunt Betty, Uncle Jim, all of them, all the kids, grandkids, and they all come and do a intervention.
Oh man, it's what an uphill battle.
Exactly.
I've got one of those, actually kind of up there. One of my goddaughters had to get out a restraining order against her mother. Her mother was like the superb guilt, anger, pouting, nag, create crisis, love bomber.
Yeah.
And my oldest goddaughter is quite disabled, and the stress of it was just making her condition worse. She would get a restraining order against mom, so what does mom do? Mom calls me
Yes.
and asks me to intervene on her behalf. And I just said, no, I'm sorry, I can't do that. And boy, she was mad. She played the anger one on me. And that was just, no, that's it.
So by the time you get through
It's-
this, how much time has passed?
Oh my gosh.
I'm going for
It could
days
be
and months.
months.
Exactly. That's what I, me when I talk about be ready for a war.
Yeah, because with her, I remember, it was months.
And that wears you down after a while.
No wonder you need to go to you.
Yeah, it's really true. Now, time did heal quite a few things in that particular situation, but it was, a lot of time was needed,
Yeah.
like years.
I have a question. So you're going to enforce a boundary, or you're going to advise somebody to enforce a boundary. But when is it and how is that subtlety of negotiating that boundary, right? When do you have that negotiation out of love, and when do you know?
Okay, so let me give you the next one, because it ties in with that.
Okay.
So some people will propose a compromise. So let's say you say to a guy, this relationship's done, don't contact me, don't want to see you. And they say, well, couldn't we just go for coffee like once a month and still be friends? So that makes it sound like a very reasonable thing to ask, but that's just, if they can get you to do that, then they can rope you back in.
Yeah.
So what you have to be aware of is, I can't negotiate a compromise unless both people are working at changing and growing. Because what I think is important to understand is this: a narcissist refuses to accept your boundary ever. And so your narcissist will use every trick in the world, and they will keep it up for months and even years. So you've heard of women who've dated a narcissist and they break it up, and to him, he can't accept that because that makes him look bad. And so he still says, you're my girl. So if she dates somebody else, he's mad and he's out to try to stop that because I own you and you can't do that to me. And so that can go on for years because they can't let go, because it then would mean they have to look at their own failures. So narcissists and boundaries, this is where you're going to get the ones that use hooks the most are the narcissists. So you can't negotiate with a narcissist. But what they look for is somebody that is open to negotiate with healthy people, and if they know that they can play you and say, oh, okay, I want to negotiate with you, they'll act like they want to negotiate, but it's only just to manipulate. So that's where you really have to keep people at a distance until you know, is this person working on themselves? Because if they're not, and I let them closer, and then I try to push them back out, it ain't going to happen without a huge war.
Where's stalking fit in here? Like if somebody tries all of these
So,
things and it eventually
yeah.
progresses to stalking?
Yeah, so that's the person that doesn't let go. But one of the things that is used is fear
Zero.
and threats. Right,
Counter boundaries. Counter boundaries.
explain.
I have a couple people where once you give your boundaries, they're like, oh, then I can't. And then some of it's kind of imaginary,
Yeah.
comes out of that, but it's, I think, also from the narcissist, right? It's
Oh,
like,
exactly.
oh, I gotta one-up you now,
Exactly.
I have to push this thing further,
Yeah.
so pretty quickly, yeah, they're not returning calls and they're giving their own boundaries. They're hoping to make you think you've gone too far.
Exactly. So you reject me, I'll reject you more. You set a boundary, I'll set a better boundary. That's what you're talking about? Yeah. And so it becomes, oh, prove I'm healthier than you, or I'm better than you, or I'm better at doing this than you.
I think some of it probably has to do with their complex trauma. They've had people enforce boundaries, but it was really false, so now they're trying to call your bluff
Yeah.
and test whether you're real or not. When you don't respond, then they have no choice but to shut you out, because they'll never go back on the boundaries.
Exactly. Yeah.
With that narcissist, you cannot lessen, you cannot give in just even a
Exactly.
little bit.
Yeah.
Just one little bit and it's done.
Yeah, exactly. And that's why I tell clients, you gotta slam that door shut.
Yeah,
If you open it even a millimeter, they
Yeah.
think they've won.
yeah, yeah. Then they try to push in.
Exactly. Yeah. And the sad thing is that deeply shamed people are attracted to narcissists. Because the narcissist looks so wonderful and heroic, and they let them in too soon. And so, what I tell clients all the time, what I see happen all the time in early recovery, is you let people in too soon, and then you realize this is a sick duck. Now how do I push them out? It's easier to gradually let them in than it is to push them out. But most everybody in recovery will let somebody in too soon, and it's often a pushy person or a person they think they fell in love with, but they didn't check out their character. And then they realize, now I got a problem, what do I do? And it is super hard to push a person back out.
Just even open that door, just crack, just even to be friendly.
Okay, so that brings up a very good point. We kind of talked about it. So I use Kim. So when she started helping at React and some of that, I would say you have to set firm boundaries with this person. If you act even really nice to them, they'll think you're going to want to take them home in your back pocket and have them as a puppy or something like that. And she goes, I can't set a boundary, firm boundary, that's being rude. I go, you've got to be rude with some people. That's the only way they're going to get it. If you're nice at all, and not like, you got to be nice and firm, but if you're nice and soft or anything like that, that's sending all the wrong messages to them. But for somebody that's never had to be firm and feel like rude, that just seems so wrong. And sadly, in the world we work in, you got to do that sometimes. Okay? Any other questions on that? Okay, so what then are the issues behind why we do this? Because that's where I want them to go. So I don't enforce boundaries. So what people say is, well, if only my parents were different and they would respect my boundaries. And so what you're wanting everybody else to change and respect your boundaries, I go, no, that's backwards. You have to learn to enforce them. You can't control their changing, you can change yourself. So what is keeping you, why are you vulnerable to these tactics? What makes you vulnerable? Because once you realize that, then you understand the deeper issues that have to change and where you have to grow. Okay? So I think you begin to realize the underlying issues that have come up so far is shame. So shame says if I set a boundary, I might offend them or hurt their feelings, or I've never stood up for myself in my whole life. I let people walk all over me. I don't know how to stand up for myself. So how I say to clients is this. If you don't learn to respect yourself, you'll never set boundaries right. So self-respect means I'm worth fighting for. It means I'm worth protecting. It means I'm worth getting help. So I have to have that basic self-respect before I'll ever be successful about it. And clients get that. But do you realize how hard that is? That is changing a whole approach to life and no longer believing a whole lot of lies about myself. Sadly, one of the things that I've seen that have come out of churches, well, a couple things that are around boundaries. The first is that if you love somebody, and we're loving Christians, we don't set boundaries. And you just are sweet, nice all the time. That's kind of how love can be defined. And that's sad, and I like to take people through the Old Testament and see how God set boundaries with Israel. So God set a boundary, said if you do this, here's the consequence. They did it, the consequence brought them back. Then they rebel again, more consequences, and then finally God kicked them out. And he sent them into captivity. And so I said, God never once enables Israel. They repent, he allows them back. But if they continue, he'll eventually boot them out. And then hopefully they'll learn the lesson and come back. So there's no enabling, just being syrupy sweet. So boundaries requires the hard part of love, the tough part of love. And for many people, the tough part feels cruel. It doesn't feel loving. Because you're saying no to somebody, you're kicking them out, And they go, ooh, that just feels so cruel. And I go, that's the tough part, but that's love. So if you allow them to stay the way they are, that's actually cruel. Because you are letting them continue and you're enabling their irresponsibility and hurt to themselves and others. So that's an important piece for them, that self-respect. Okay, what are some other underlying issues around boundaries? Okay. So abandonment and these all start overlapping and tying together. But abandonment is if I set boundaries, I might end up all alone. And I'm afraid of being alone. So that's where you then get into that fear is the primary piece of shame. Fear is the primary piece of abandonment. But if I set boundaries, people won't like me. If I set boundaries, I might be alone. If I set boundaries, people might get mad and reject me and not want to be my friend anymore. So all of those come into play. What are other underlying issues?
I think some of the hardest boundaries to set are between mothers and children, maybe. I find, like, it's like, yeah, I'm not overdoing it for them and trying to make sure, you know, like, because you don't want to listen. So, I'm struggling with that.
Okay.
Like confrontation.
Yes. So guilt, confrontation, avoidance of confrontation. So guilt-based parenting is, I don't want to set boundaries with my kids because I've hurt them so much in the past. So I want to try to compensate for the damage I've done by being poor at boundaries. And what I want people to see is you're not doing that because it's good for the kids. You're doing that because it makes you feel better. And that actually ends up being bad parenting. But it's a
false sense
powerful
of
thing.
responsibility.
Yes,
Like a
false sense of
You're
responsibility.
responsible for my.
So I call that both false guilt. So let me give you an example. I spend a time on false guilt, but I do it in the sense that God has built into us a conscience, but then parents help train that conscience. So if you are in complex trauma, that conscience usually gets mistrained so that you feel guilty for stuff that you didn't do wrong. So dad says, you should have known what I was thinking. You should have known I want a quiet evening. So now you believe you should be able to read people's minds. And then you feel guilty when somebody's hurt by you because you didn't read their mind. They didn't communicate to you. So that is a false guilt, but then you go, all that false responsibility. You should be taking care of this person. They're going to commit suicide if you don't rescue them. And you feel a responsibility for everybody. And then mom's really sad, it's your fault because you've been such a problem, so now you feel responsible for mom's emotions. Dad's angry because you're a bad kid, you feel responsible for his emotions. And so now you have all of this false sense of guilt and responsibility. And that makes you have bad boundaries.
I think another issue could be that when people play triangles, they switch to triangles and they also put us in the rescuer role, and that gives you a sense of doing something good.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah, and that's very important because for a lot of people, they only got validated when they went against they did something unhealthy. So you rescued somebody you shouldn't and you got validated. You helped somebody by protecting their secret and you got validated.
By being codependent.
Exactly, exactly. So codependency is really kind of tied up in all of these because now I'm responsible for you more than I should be, and I can't be happy unless you're happy, so I have to do all of this stuff for you. So a huge issue, yeah.
Remember one time I had a man in my office? The son had left the home. The son was an adult son, young adult, early 20s. he left the home, and he was around. From time to time, he would get in contact with his parents. But his father was so beside himself. His father was just weeping in my office, hadn't worked in 6 months because the son had left the home. And I thought, my gosh, if I was your son, I think I'd leave too. But, you know, the father was just distraught.
Yes.
And they were New Canadians.
Yeah.
So I think part of it was there, it was cultural.
Yes,
But,
It proved that the parent failed.
exactly.
yeah.
But it's a very common thing. So I get all the time where kids feel obligated to go visit their parents every week and spend all this time with them. And I go, why do you feel such an obligation? Your parents are toxic, but they can't not feel that way. And it's very detrimental for them. Yeah, good point. Anything else around underlying issues, okay? So that's in our issue, but we're not done yet, because what you go to next is, when am I my own worst enemy? So when am I most vulnerable to not enforce? So, for example, I use the example, you're overtired, you're a single mom, and you say, just do whatever you want, just don't bug me tonight. And so you've been enforcing boundaries consistently, but now tonight you're just so tired you let them away with murder. Okay? Other times when I'm my own worst enemy, when I drop the boundary that I've been enforcing.
I've been spending too much time alone.
Okay? So we call that
Come to time.
the effect of loneliness. Now, I hope nobody's offended, but the next one goes with that one. So a lot of boundaries come down when you get a bunch of lovesick, sex-crazed people that aren't getting that.
I think I'll word that differently in my
What are you gonna
How
say?
about when you're thinking?
Yeah, so a relapse, yeah. So just to put that one in a different terminology, it's whenever you have a major need unmet. So you're lonely. God made you to need relationships, but you've been isolated. And so now that need becomes so powerful that you go back to just finding somebody to hang out with, and you violate all your own boundaries. So what I want people to understand is this: you can only meet or stick to boundaries if you've dealt with your underlying issues, but if you're meeting all your God-given needs, 12 needs, in a healthy way. Because if you're not meeting your needs, you're setting yourself up for a desire that is so powerful it will overpower your commitment to a boundary.
But if you're meeting all those 12 needs, you still get triggered, right?
Okay,
And that's,
yes,
you default.
exactly. So triggers and awareness of your default setting. So it's back to that self-awareness piece. I can be doing really well, but I get a trigger and all my boundaries go out the window. Okay?
So is a trigger like a default setting? I'm not quite sure what a
A
default.
So, no, a default setting is, if, let's say you just stop doing your quiet time in the morning and having good conversations, and you just start sliding back to your old emotional default and your old thinking default. Triggers is somebody scares you or rejects you or disrespects you.
It's like a quicker.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
I know for myself when I'm really in a great space.
Okay.
I'm so happy.
Okay. So that's where I was going to go next, because it's a huge thing. Mental health. So mental health affects your boundaries in one of two ways. So if you have anything that looks like mania, so you have a success, you accomplish something, You've had a mountaintop experience with God. You are feeling absolutely fantastic. How does that affect your boundary?
You could go, oh, what the heck, this one time, like, right? It's sort of lenient, it's all like,
I'm
okay.
grateful I can handle it right.
Okay, exactly. Or let's party.
Yeah,
Let's celebrate. Or hey, look, I feel like a new TV. I feel like a trip to Hawaii. Let's just,
Right.
and you start
Oh, what it is
violating
tonight,
boundaries. Has anybody had a friend, close friend who's bipolar? Who's been manic?
Oh, yeah.
So then they call you like 20 times a day because their inhibitions disappear. They're healthy inhibitions. Then they're spending money. You can't confront them because they're not rational. And so when you get into an elevated emotional state, you're vulnerable to not maintaining boundaries with yourself or with others. And then the flip side is anxiety or depression. So how do those affect your boundaries? No to everything. Yep, your bubble just got a whole lot bigger. I don't want to deal with people, don't want to do what I normally do because I don't feel like it. Okay, so here, what part of the brain got triggered? So what's the whole thing about what causes us to change boundaries? Limbic is what are all of these playing on? Limbic. Guilt, anger, fear. So we set boundaries in the cortex. We decide this is healthy, this is safe, this is what I need to do. And we maintain them as long as our limbic isn't triggered. But we get it triggered, and that's what makes us forget what we established in the cortex.
I think for vulnerable should be stress, like that's
Yes.
actually a bigger trigger than some.
So a big one for most is stress, or if they feel hopeless or overwhelmed. So what can happen with that? Some people with stress, they expect everybody to change their boundaries for their sake. So now I'm needier, so I want to call you 50 times a day. I want you to come over right now because I am so stressed out. So your expectations of others' boundaries changes. See that? But also for some people, I'm so stressed I can't deal with people, I want to isolate. So you go into changing your own boundaries. Or I'm so stressed, and this is always interesting, I ask clients when you're really stressed, how many of you start doing activities that have no value at all? You reorganize the kitchen when it's just been reorganized yesterday, but you just got to keep busy. But you stop doing the very things that feed your soul. So you change your boundaries by doing what's unimportant instead of what feeds your soul. And that's the effect of stress on boundaries. Okay?
So I'm thinking right there, of like, for me, it would be like, the flight, fight,
Yes,
freeze.
exactly.
So I freeze, I just
Exactly.
shut down.
So all of these are triggering fight, flight, freeze. So the changing of a boundary is you're going into fight, flight, or shutting her down.
So could you use that like say stress and you go into like just not time to yourself?
Right.
Could that be just like a health
Exactly.
thing so you
Yeah.
don't do
Okay.
something bad?
Yeah. So what I want people to realize, the next part of the tools for boundaries is when I'm stressed, I need to withdraw to recharge, but I don't need to isolate. So there's a fine line boundary between healthy withdrawal and unhealthy withdrawal. When I'm stressed, I need to just take a day to relax. But there's a healthy relax and an unhealthy relax. So boundaries are what I have to figure out about a good gift from God. When does it cross into a being misused gift? And that's very important because for all or nothing thinking, it says, I'm stressed, I want to isolate. And you go, no, we got to find the middle where healthy is on the withdrawal part. And that's That's very difficult, because then that brings with it a grade. Well, just tell me where. No, you gotta figure out the where. And it's different for every person, and they don't like that. Okay, good question. Anything else? Okay,
I think it takes a few important steps. First, to identify what you're dealing with,
exactly,
and then to choose the right response to that.
exactly.
Because if you misunderstand what's happening, you're gonna react the wrong way with good intention.
Yeah. So tomorrow, we're going to look at setting boundaries, both external boundaries, internal boundaries, the tools. So just to get you thinking about that, quickly write down the 5 closest people to you in your life. And then beside it, rank the relationship in healthiness from 1 to 10. So 1, it's a disaster gong show. 10, it's a wonderful, healthy relationship. Now, if it's the person sitting beside you that's one of those people on the list, you might want to cover your paper.
Sounds best.
So, sorry.
5 people closest to you, and then rank each relationship as to how healthy it is.
Oh, not who you feel the closest to.
Right. Healthy, yeah. So the 5 are the people you feel closest to,
Yeah.
and then rank each of the relationships. So let's say my relationship with Kim, so rank it, scale of 1 to 10 as to how healthy it is. Next person. Now, what you have to be prepared for when you do this in a class is some people don't have 5 close people.
Yeah.
And so they automatically start feeling bad because they don't know who to put on their list.
The cat, the dog.
Exactly. So what I do with this whole thing with clients is you have to include in your list yourself and God. So now you can put 7 on your list if you didn't get those already. Okay, are you able to concentrate if I talk? Or is your mind off evaluating all your friendships?
So if you put yourself on there, it's the relationship you have with yourself.
Probably the toughest for most people, and it's usually the lowest score.
And it's healthy.
So here's what I want clients to see. What I would ask them is say, okay, if it's you rank that relationship as a 6. So it's kind of middle between healthy, unhealthy. What would it take to move it to a 7 or an 8? And what it would take to move from a 7 or 8 is a new boundary or a change boundary. So improving a relationship from where it is to where you want it to be, what would need to change to make it healthy? That's the boundary piece. So we do this as an exercise because it makes people think very here and now. Because what a lot of people will do is they want to complain about relationships, they just don't want to have the courage to set a boundary to improve the relationship. Because they might lose it. So they just complain about the relationship. And so now I want them to see is you have basically control about what you're going to do with this relationship and what you think you should try in order to make it better. So that what it would take to make it better is the first piece in setting some boundaries or thinking about boundaries in relationships. Make sense? Okay, so we're going to dig into that tomorrow. But I do want to tell you 2 stories first. Tonight we'll end with that. So if you want like a 3-minute break, you can grab it.
Grab a brownie.
Throwing soda.
Very, very well done. I wish it had more around the complex trauma piece, but it's still very, very helpful, and it's one that we recommend to clients to read if they want further reading and helpful material, and it has exercises and things in there for them that are helpful.
They have a program around it with videos, 8 sessions and
Yes.
workbooks, and some churches run that
Yeah,
program.
so, yes, and they do a great job. One of the things that you can think of moving forward, what we started doing at React is using Tuesday nights to offer a React week to the public. So we do an 8-week course on boundaries, an 8-week course on anger management in light of complex trauma. And it's been very, very good as far as just making more people aware and starting to work on themselves without having the commitment of being there every day.
What was the name of that book that you said?
Boundaries now.
Boundaries by Cloud and Townsend. Has anybody heard over the years, Chuck Swindoll used to say a poem called "One by One God Took Them From Me"? Anybody heard that poem? Okay, I will quote it to you. I learned it as a young man, I guess in my teens, but one by one God took them from me, all the things I valued most, till I was empty-handed, every glittering toy was lost. Then it goes on, I walked earth's highways, grieving in my rags and poverty, until I heard his voice inviting, lift those empty hands to me. And I turned my hands toward heaven, and he filled them with the store of his own transcendent riches, till they could contain no more. I love that, because what it does, especially with addicts, but with all of us, there's certain things that we want to hang on to. We don't want to let go of because we think we can't live without them, and sometimes God has to take them from us. And he leaves us empty-handed, but his purpose in doing that is never to be cruel, so he could fill our hands with something better. Okay? So the story in the Bible that's actually around that is the book of Ruth. And what's important to understand that is that Ruth has a conclusion and an introduction, and both have 71 words exactly. Now when that happens, you pay attention. And so what the 71 words of the introduction are all about? What happens in the introduction of Ruth?
Naomi's coming.
Naomi and her husband have a famine. They go to Moab. Her husband dies. Her 2 sons die. God empties her. Why does he empty her? For the last 71 words. And what are the last 71 words of the book?
Filling your hands.
Fill her empty hands with what? Children, King David, Messiah. So he had to empty her to fill her up with an even better gift. And so the whole book of Ruth is purposely designed around that. So what makes that even more clear is when Naomi decides to go back to Bethlehem and she meets the women of Bethlehem. She says, don't call me Naomi anymore, call me Mara, because God has emptied me. So she comes back, not saying that God has emptied me, I'm happy about it. She comes back bitter. That's what Mara means. It shattered her faith in God. So, a couple of things with that. Anybody know what Bethlehem means?
House of bread.
House of bread. So they were from the luscious farmland in all of Israel, Bethlehem, the house of bread. And there was a famine, and they hung in there, and they lost everything. They even had to sell their land. And then they go to Moab, and remember Moab, that cursed tribe. And then disaster, disaster, disaster. And in that culture, women didn't work. So your only options as a woman was to beg or prostitution. And so if you didn't have a man to take care of you, you were in deep trouble. So she has 2 daughter-in-laws, and that's it. And she is a broken, bitter woman and comes back. So when God refills her, he first has to refill her faith. Then he refills her hands. How does he refill her faith? Because that's what a lot of the book is about. So they come back,
They start cleaning.
gleaning. So, remember we talked about providence a couple of nights last week? So people making human decisions, but somehow God's working out a plan that we don't know. So Ruth doesn't know anybody. She just says, Naomi's too old to work. I have to do something. So in that culture, when they harvested a field in Exodus, Leviticus, do you know how God told them to harvest it? In a circle.
Leaving the outskirts of.
All the four corners were left untouched. Why? That was for the poor. And then people could follow behind the gleaners in order to pick up any stray pieces that were dropped. So that's how they would provide. So Ruth says that, but Naomi is so fearful because what was happening in the culture at that time is if a woman went out by herself, especially a young woman, they would get raped. That was the culture. And so just so happens, and that's what you find in this book, God's Providence, it just so happens that Ruth picks the family or the field of Boaz, a relative. And then she comes home and she has way more food, way more grain than you would get from gleaning. And Naomi says, "What's going on here?" And Ruth says, "Well, this really, really nice man, I ended up in his field and he gave me extra grain at the end of the day. Who is this man? Boaz." And then she goes, "Okay, God, you're taking care of me." And something shifts in Naomi. And you know what happens next? She says to Ruth, "You have to go and propose to be married to him." So that's what happens next. So do you remember part of the story where Ruth goes and she uncovers his feet? Do you remember that part?
Yes.
It doesn't make any sense to
Doesn't
us.
make sense to
After
us.
his work, and get a few.
So after the men were finished threshing, so the whole threshing time at harvest was a huge celebration. The whole town came together to a high hill where the wind was blowing the most. They thresh, party, and then they lie down to sleep. And so how a woman would propose is she would go and say, "Cover me with your blanket. So bring me under your protection." So what Ruth does, she goes when he's sleeping and uncovers his feet and lays down, so the cold air would wake him up, and then he'd wake up, "Who's touching me?" And he wakes up and, "Who's there?" And she says, "Please cover me with your blanket." She proposes marriage. And then he goes through the whole thing of, well, there's a closer relative who has first chance and all of that. And then eventually he marries her. So for Boaz to marry Ruth, you know why the other guy didn't want to marry Ruth?
She wasn't Israelite.
Okay, that's part of it. That's not the whole piece.
And they had to raise the seed of the dead.
Exactly. So whoever married Ruth, his children with Ruth wouldn't be his kids.
For at least the first child.
Yeah. It would be the son of the husband that died, and he would have to buy her, pay the dowry price, and that would go to him and he wouldn't see any. So if it cost him $100,000, he would not see a nickel of that. That was all going to be given away. So the other guy says, "I'm not willing to do that." And Boaz does, and she gets married, and then she has a son, and then Jesse, then David, then Messiah. And so God emptied her to fill her with an even greater blessing than she could ever have dreamed possible. So I love that story in relationship to people coming to us. They've been empty. Some still got a few things they're clutching onto. And God sometimes takes that away, but it's always to give them an even greater blessing than they've ever experienced before. So that's the story of Ruth. Now Jonah. Everybody familiar with Jonah, right? The guy got swallowed by a fish. So God says, "Go to Nineveh and preach." And what does Jonah do? He goes in the exact opposite direction. Okay, gets on a ship heading west. Nineveh was east, so Nineveh would be in modern day Iran, Iraq area. and he gets on the Mediterranean and goes west. A storm comes up, and here's the part I want you to get. Jonah's asleep in the belly of the ship. Remember, they wake him up, say, what's going on here? You must have angered your gods. And so Jonah said, what does Jonah tell them to do?
Throw 'em over.
Throw him over. Now here's what I want you to get. Jonah is saying, help me commit suicide. I'd rather die than obey God. So he is asking for a suicidal death. And then he comes out of that. Now you have to imagine after being 3 days in the belly of a fish and all the gastric juices, I think he came out kind of white and splotchy hair, and he wasn't looking like a front of Forbes magazine or anything like that. He was a mess. So you imagine him showing up in Nineveh saying, listen to God, folks. Well, yeah, better listen to God. But after he preaches and they repent, what does he do? You remember?
He waits on the mountain to see what's gonna happen,
Exactly.
and he gets angry because.
It's angry at God. And so he's preached repentance, but he doesn't want them to repent. So the point is, he's obeying God, but he doesn't have God's heart. Okay? So God begins to expose to him what Jonah's heart is like. So he has this, he's out in the desert, and Kim and I were just there in Egypt, and it was 43 on most days, like just blistering hot. So he's out in the desert, and he's watching Nineveh, hoping God sends fire and judgment and wipes these people out. He wants a front row seat. And he starts to complain about the heat. And he gets angry at God about the heat and about Nineveh. So here's his first priority in his heart: his own comfort. And so what does God do to reinforce that? He makes a vine grow very quickly and provides shade. And what does Jonah do? He has a Thanksgiving service. Thank you, God. You're such a wonderful God. Why? Because you gave me my selfish needs. You made my life comfortable again. And then a worm comes along and eats it. What does he do? Complains and asks to die. Just pouts and carries on because you're making me uncomfortable. So God is pointing out, your priority is not my heart. Your priority is your own comfort. And at the very end of the book, God says this: don't I have, do you remember, don't I have 250,000? Do you remember what he says?
Who don't distinguish left from right.
Right. So who doesn't know their left hand from the right?
Children?
Children and people with disabilities, severe mental disabilities. So he's saying to Jonah, you want me to wipe out a city that has 250,000 children? What kind of heart do you have, Jonah? So he just drives home. You are serving me, obeying me, but your heart is so wrong. But here's what I love. God still used him, even though he didn't have it all together. Even though the day before he's wanting to commit suicide or tried to commit suicide, even though his life was still very self-focused, God graciously used him. And so that, I think, is helpful for a lot of people to realize I don't have to have my act totally together before God can use me. He uses some very broken people who have very mixed motivation.
And
There
why
you-
didn't you want them to repent?
Because he didn't, well,
There was a prophecy that they will hurt Israel in the future.
exactly.
And he didn't want to let that happen. He wanted them to rather die.
Do you know how people of Nineveh treated captured people? They put great big fish hooks. You can read about it in Habakkuk, and it's mentioned in Jonah. But they put big fish hooks in their nose, their face, and dragged them. And they had the cruelest of tortures at that time in the world. And so Jonah's frustration is, God, why aren't you judging them? Why are you judging Israel and not them? They're worse than us. And I don't like your grace and forgiveness, God. At the very heart, I want you to be an angry God. Only when it applies to my enemies. But when it applies to me, You gotta make them comfortable. Okey doke. That's our evening.